Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Now, I am a political journalist. I was given a good piece of advice when I got my current job, which was to interview 3 politicians every day. And I can tell you from this experience, they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. But the one thing they do have is incredible social skills. And so when you spend time with politicians, they stand too close, they invade your personal space, they'll grab the back of your head, rub your cheek. Just a few weeks ago, I was at the National Institutes of Health near where I live, and a neuroscientist showed me a video of a girl with Williams syndrome. And Williams syndrome from the outside looks like reverse autism. And so the girl is 18 months old. She has no interest in physical objects. She has only interest in social signals. And so she's in the room with a 12-year-old boy, and she's standing way too close to him, just staring into his eyes. And I'm watching this video of the little girl, and I'm thinking, this is every politician I've ever covered. This is what they have. And yet the paradox is that when they start talking about public policy, they sometimes lose all that social subtlety. And I've covered in my course of my life a whole series of policy failures that derive from the fact that our policymakers often have an insufficiently complex view of human nature. My country, our leaders went into Iraq on the supposition, sort of oblivious to the cultural and psychological realities of Iraq. I once asked a senior member of the Bush administration, I can't tell you who she is, but I asked her, didn't you guys get sort of the culture and psychology of Iraq wrong? And she said, I don't really believe in culture. I think if you change the institutions, you change the society. And that is the correct political science answer. It does happen to be the correct answer. And then we had a financial system based on the supposition that bankers are prudent, rational, self-interested creatures who would never do anything stupid en masse. That turned out not to be true. And the issue I care most about in the US, and I think here too, we've had 30 years of education reform, all of which has had disappointing results, because in general it's skirted the core issue, which is the individual relationship between a teacher and a student. And people learn from people they love, but if you mention the word love at a congressional hearing, they look at you like you're, Oprah Winfrey or something like that. It's just not the way you talk. And I decided this was not only a political problem, but a wider cultural problem. That we've inherited a view of ourselves that we're divided selves. We have reason over here and emotion over here. And if anything, they're on a teeter-totter, that if reason is up and emotion is down, or vice versa. And society advances to the extent that reason can suppress the passions. And so this has created methodologies of studying human behavior that try to use the methodologies of physics to do social science, which emphasize the things we can count and measure, and which amputate all the rest. It's created a culture in which we're very good at talking about material things, pretty bad at talking about emotion, very good when we're raising our kids to emphasize skills, but very bad at talking about the most important thing, which is character. And so this is sort of the shallow way we raise our kids, which goes with the shallow way I think we conduct some of our policy, and some of the shallow moral philosophy. Alistair MacIntyre, the great philosopher, said we have words like courage, honor, and virtue, but we don't really have systems that link these three things together. And so while I'm covering some of this imperfect view of human nature, I'm looking over at this other world, the world that RSA is in, and I'm seeing people who are actually giving us profounder answers to what's going on deep inside ourselves. And the odd thing is, this world is not primarily led by philosophers and theologians, but it's led by people who study the mind. Cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, sociologists, behavioral economists. And I believe we're in the middle of this tremendous revolution, understanding who we are deep down inside. And I think a lot of this research in all these different fields coheres around 3 foundational principles. And the first foundational principle is that most of our thinking is below awareness, it's unconscious. And that the conscious mind does maybe 2% of our cognition. But one of the things we're finding is the unconscious is actually quite intelligent. That when Freud thought of his conception of the unconscious, it was a tangled web of erotic urges. But really, the diversity of unconscious processes are really different systems to understand the world and helping you detect unconscious or patterns in the world, helping you do a conversation, helping you, if you're an academic, to work on a problem, and then suddenly the solution to that problem will bubble up from your unconscious and you'll have a eureka moment. And so unconscious processes are not primitive passions. Sometimes they're very powerful and can be relied upon. The second insight after the power of the unconscious is the idea that emotion is not separate from reason, but emotion is the foundation from reason. People who have lesions and can't process emotions are not super smart Mr. Spocks, they're super dumb. Because what emotion does, it assigns value to things. And if you can't assign value to things, your decision-making landscape is hopelessly flat, and you can't make wise decisions. Emotions tell you what to value, they tell you what to remember, they literally wire the fibers of the brain together. And then the third insight is that we're not individual creatures who are really autonomous from one another. We are deeply interpenetrated one from another. And that when you look at me, your brain is reacting to the things I'm doing as if you yourself are doing them. And that we're deeply interpenetrated by things sometimes we're not even aware of, by gesture, by smell. One of my favorite experiments done in Germany, they took gauze pads, put it under people's arms, and had some of the people watch a horror movie, other people watch a comedy. And then they had other research subjects who were presumably very well paid, had them sniff the gauze pads. And they said, what movie did this person watch? And people could tell at way above average rates what movie they watched by the sense of smell. And we're often only vaguely aware of the power of smell. But people who lose the power of smell suffer greater emotional deterioration than people who lose any other sense. And this is just an example of the way we're deeply interpenetrated one with another. And I think if you take these three foundational principles, you are reminded of sort of a different view of human nature. And to put it in sports terms, the French Enlightenment loses, the British or Scottish Enlightenment wins. That René Descartes, who thought reason was tremendously powerful and put emphasis on finding the abstract laws of universal laws of behavior, that's probably not who we are. But David Hume and Adam Smith and Edmund Burke and others who said that reason is weak, but the sentiments are strong, and that we're primarily social and not rational creatures, they had a much more accurate view of human nature. And once you make this shift and really rediscover this old way of looking at the world, you not only begin to see politics in a different way, you see, for example, human capital in a different way. And so when we think about human capital in our current mode, we tend to emphasize SAT scores, or what we call SAT scores, test scores, IQ scores, years in education. But those things are important. 25% of the variation in job performance, roughly, is explained by IQ. So IQ is important. But 75% is other things. And many of those other things are emotional and unconscious. And I'll just in 3 minutes run through a few of those other traits that I think are tremendously important. One is mind sight, the ability to look into other people's minds and download what they have to offer. Babies come equipped with this ability. Alan Meltzoff in 1979 leaned over a baby who was 43 minutes old, wagged his tongue at the baby, and the baby wagged her tongue back. She didn't know what a face was, but they know they're supposed to mimic. And that's roughly how we learn. We mimic each other. And so in the United States, and probably here too, 55% of babies at 18 months have established a two-way relationship with mom. And they not only know how to relate to mom, but they know how to build relationships with other people that they will meet later in life. And so scientists can take a look at these babies, how they relate to mom at 18 months, and they can predict with 77% accuracy who's going to graduate from high school. The second trait is equipoise, which is the ability to look inside oneself and be aware of one's own biases. So for example, human beings are tremendous overconfidence machines. 96% of university professors believe they have above average teaching skills. Time magazine recently asked Americans, are you in the top 1% of earners? 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners. And yet some people have the ability, what the scientists call metacognition, to look in themselves and correct for their own biases. This is a special problem for men, by the way. Overconfidence is a strongly gender-linked trait. So men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous faith in their ability to swim after they've been drinking. But some people have the ability to adjust the strength of their conclusions to the strength of their evidence, to overcome from this overconfidence bias, to build modesty bootstraps for themselves. Peter Drucker famously said, when you make a decision, write it down, seal it in an envelope, open it up in 9 months, and come back and read your analysis of why you made that decision. You'll find a third of your decisions were right, a third were wrong, a third were in between, but in almost all cases, your reasoning was completely irrelevant. And so that's an example of people who construct modesty bootstraps for themselves. The third trait is a Greek word, metis, the ability to look over an environment and detect the essential patterns. My newspaper did a great story of soldiers in Iraq who could look down a street and tell where there was an IED, a landmine, in that street. And when you asked them, how do you know? They said, I couldn't really tell you, I just feel a coldness inside. And that's because over months of careful observation, they had automatized the knowledge of how to see a street. And training yourself to see the world in a certain way and to process the world in a certain way is a tremendously powerful trait. The final one I'll mention is sympathy, the ability to scan a social environment to figure out how to work within that social environment. Most of us work in groups, and that's because groups are more effective than individuals. There was a study I saw recently where they looked at Olympic swimmers in the last Olympics, compared their individual times to the times they scored on relay when they were part of a relay team. Swimmers swim faster as part of the relay team than they do as individuals because that group dynamic fits in. And so these are just some of the traits that I think are tremendously important to how we do in life, and they illustrate the power of these unconscious emotional and interpersonal processes. And just to end, in the course of the book, I came across a passage that sort of illustrated a lot of the things that I think we're learning about ourselves. And it's a sad passage, but I thought I'd read it to you because I think it's a memorable way of understanding the crucial aspects of who we are. And it's from a book by a guy named Douglas Hofstadter. Hofstadter is a great scientist at the University of Indiana. And Hofstadter was in Italy on sabbatical with his wife, Carol, and their 2 kids, who at that point were 5 and 2. And Carol, very suddenly and very shockingly, I think suffered a stroke and died very quickly while her kids were at that age. And Hofstadter kept a photograph of Carol on the bureau in his bedroom. And he probably saw this photograph every day, several times a day. But on one particular day, a couple months after his wife had died, he took a look at this photograph with particular attention. And here's what he wrote in his book, I'm a Strange Loop, about that phenomenon. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once I found myself saying as tears flowed, that's me, that's me. And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. And so the Greeks used to say we suffer our way to wisdom, and the wisdom Hofstadter suffered his way to is that the loops in our brain are shared loops, and that they were deeply interpenetrated one with another. And in a shallower and less tragic way, I think the policy failures of the last several decades illustrate the wisdom that if we have a shallow view of human nature that treats us as rational, calculating animals, we will yield policies of insufficient value, of insufficient success. And the good news to end on is the fact that now scientists around the world are coming up with a more accurate view of who we are unconsciously and emotionally. And I think this will have tremendous positive effects on the way we see the world, on the way we process policy, on the way we process each other. And a lot of that work is being done right in this building. Thanks very much.
Humanism has been around and been a very active influence on Western philosophy for several centuries. So is this about a rediscovery of something that we forgot? many of the philosophers you mention have worked within that tradition of understanding our sociality. And to sort of think about it in another way, I thought there's only one age, one place in sort of human history where it would be a surprise that we're social animals. Most cultures have deeply understood our sociality.
The brain research and all this research doesn't give us any new philosophies. People have been studying other people for a long time, and the odds that we're going to come up with something new are incredibly unlikely. But they remind you which philosophies are likely to be correct and which philosophies are likely to be wrong. And so I think when you read the researchers, they go back again and again to certain thinkers. David Hume comes up all the time. Aristotle comes up. But there are certain bad guys who are often scorned. Plato is one, the idea that our mind is a charioteer riding the passions, and the passions are these wild horses. Descartes, who I mentioned, is another, the idea that the mind is totally separate from the body. But then I think so much of what we've inherited from Keynesian economics to classical economics, so many of our institutions, as I said, from the whole financial structure, are all based on suppositions that are untrue. And so while you're right, most societies have been intensely aware of the interpersonal connections, we happen to be heirs not only to the French Enlightenment, but I would say to two very individualistic social revolutions, one in the 60s that emphasized the individual liberation on a cultural and moral front, and one in the 80s that emphasized the liberation of the individual on an economic front. And so we have first a rationalist history coming from the French Revolution, magnified by individualist revolutions coming from the 60s and the 80s, and so we happen to be particularly astray.